There is no outside power. You are the only person who can give you the gift of happiness and acceptance and affirmation. There's a Stoic philosopher, one of them, by the name of Epictetus, who was a slave. He made some very wise and profound statements. And one of them is I cannot change my external circumstances, but what I can change is how I react to those circumstances. And so this gets to the point of you giving yourself the gift of happiness, you being okay with yourself, you not try to hide your shame, but accepting it as part of you and not resisting it. It's the resistance that causes people a lot of problems.
Dr. James, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being a guest today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Uh, to get us started, I was wondering if you might do us the pleasure of giving us a little background for the people who might not be familiar with your work, your award-winning, multifaceted, and longstanding work. We're dying to hear a little bit more from you about the work that you do.
Well, that's kind of you to ask. Hopefully, my ego will stay in check. Uh, my name is Jim Doty. A little background. I grew up in a challenging environment. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child, partially paralyzed, seizure disorder. Ended up being chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We were on public assistance. So you can imagine that's a challenging background to start from. And to be honest with you, I think, as you know, and many of your listeners, there's something called adverse childhood experiences. And when children grow up in that type of an environment, where there's drug and alcohol abuse, where there's mental health issues, where there's poverty, the likelihood for them, quote unquote, succeeding in life is very, very low. And I was, if you will, saved because one person cared. And I don't mean to imply my parents didn't care, but I actually, strangely enough, walked into a magic shop when I was 12, filled with hopelessness and despair. And I met a woman there, and she was behind the counter. And I'm sure all of you have had an experience where you met somebody who had this radiant presence, and she was like that. And she introduced herself. And it turned out she was the owner's mother, and he was on an errand. But we began talking, and she asked me, frankly, some penetrating questions I normally would not have answered. But because she made me feel comfortable and she was giving me some chocolate chip cookies, I answered.
They're magic, aren't they, those chocolate chip cookies?
Exactly. Long story short, though, she said to me, listen, I'm here for another 6 weeks. If you show up every day, I'll teach you something I think that could really help you. Now, of course, I had no self awareness, no insight. Uh, but I did show up every day for 6 weeks, and it was because actually had absolutely nothing else to do. It wasn't because I had some incredible insight. The other factor, of course, was the cookies. But for that 6 week period of time, she taught me a meditation practice. And we can talk about that a little bit more in detail. But it also included a self compassion practice because, as we all know, we're often our most challenging critic. And then she taught me a way to visualize my intention, or if you want to call it manifestation. And the reason I give you that backstory is it gives you some, I think, insight into sort of my own struggle, what has resonated with me, and sets the stage for what I've become today. And basically, I desired to go to medical school, and obviously, you have to go to college for that. That did, in fact, happen. I was very fortunate. I decided to become a neurosurgeon. I became a professor at Stanford in the School of Medicine, and then a successful entrepreneur. I was the CEO of a company that went public for 1.3 billion, and also I had my own struggles during the dot-com period. I lost $80 million in 6 weeks, which, as you can imagine, might get your attention. and I was $3 million in the hole after getting rid of everything. But the interesting thing about that was it was a period of reflection, and in some ways, that's why we're here today. It was a period of reflection that made me go back and sort of analyze what had gone wrong and what had gone right. And what I meant by that was I manifested all of these desires. The problem was I was 12 years old when I made the list. And I looked through the lens, one, of scarcity and poverty. And I looked through the lens of, what seemed to make people happy. Of course, I was very misguided because I thought it was things. And so on my list, I had a Rolex watch, a Porsche, a mansion, $1 million, et cetera, et cetera. And when I went through this period of reflection after losing all of this money, I realized that all of my actions had been focused on me. I want, I want, I want, with the mistaken belief that one, me getting those things would make me happy, and the other that I wanted this external affirmation that would make me feel whole. And the reality was, when I had everything, I was more miserable than I had ever been. And so, after losing this money, and I had made some, created uh, essentially what's it called? Basically, a foundation to help people. Uh, And when I was trying to clear up the mess of this crash, of course, my banker, who I owed $15 million, became my best friend, and then my lawyer. But the lawyer told me, he said, "Jim, we we actually did not fill out the paperwork for your charitable donation, so you don't have to give that money away." And it was in stock in a company that hadn't gone public. But after this period of reflection, I wanted to, if you will, be liberated from my focus on scarcity or chasing money. And so I ended up telling him to go ahead and give all the stock away. And that stock ended up being worth $30 million. And it set up health clinics and blood banks around the world. It set up programs for the disabled, for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV. It endowed chairs at multiple universities. And what I tell people is, on some level, I went from rags to riches and then to rags. But I then got everything. And what I mean by that is I went from being focused on myself to being focused on being of service. And the reason is because one, you're the only one who can make yourself happy. And this is an internal journey. It's not an external journey of affirmation. And the other is that when you care, when you're compassionate, when you're kind, as the Dalai Lama says, if you want to make others happy, be compassionate. If you want to make yourself happy, be compassionate. And so when I changed my narrative internally to one of being of service or being compassionate, I actually got everything. Now, it wasn't necessarily financial. Uh, it was in many other things. As an example, I started a center at Stanford that examines the neuroscience and the health benefits of being compassionate and self compassionate, of which the Dalai Lama is the founding benefactor, which, of course, is extraordinary. And this led he and I to become friends. And then I became chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. And this also allowed me to meet a variety of extraordinary spiritual and religious leaders around the world, including Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, Amma, the Hugging Saint, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, the Pope, etc. And those experiences were some of the greatest gifts ever, to be around those people, to be friends with them, in some cases to advise them. It was incredibly enriching and humbling. And one of the reasons we're talking today is about a new book that I've written. And it talks about manifestation, but in a very specific way. And as an example, all of us are manifesting. It's just most of us are inefficient. It's, as an example, it's like learning a new sport. if you've never played it before, never concentrated on doing it, you may do okay. But if you imbue or learn some of the tools on how to maximize that, then the likelihood of you manifesting dramatically increases. But the most important question is, do you understand the difference between what you want and what you need?
Very, very well said. You're right. This is the reason we're on the phone today, or I guess, however you call this, whatever it is that we're doing here, besides having a conversation virtually. My, what is, what I feel like I know about that I would like to add to your intro is that there is a profound connection between your background in medicine and this spiritual journey and the manifestation through your own experience. And I feel like the obvious question to start with is there's I think so many of us have the experience of manifesting, you know, things that we're very, very intent about, or things that maybe we can connect the dots looking backwards. And that seems like one corner of the universe. And then medicine and science seems like a different corner of the universe. And I'm wondering if you could help us connect the dots as a neuroscientist. What's actually happening there, and why should we pay attention?
Uh, Obviously, that's a very long question.
I need it
Or
in a paragraph, Jim.
yeah, yeah, or multiple questions, but it does all connect. And but in some ways, to answer the question, we have to start at the beginning. And what I mean by that is, if you look at our evolution as a species, uh, many mammals, and especially humans, our offspring don't run off into the forest or swim away or whatever when we're born. Our offspring have to be cared for, and not just cared for a week or a month. I mean, literally, well over a decade. And that is an immense requirement for time and resources. Well, why would you do that? The reason you do it is because you have a genetic imperative to do it. And what I mean by that is, and it goes back to the quote I mentioned from the Dalai Lama, when there is somebody who is suffering, in pain, hurting, hungry, uh, uh, especially in regard to our offspring, we feel for them and we want to alleviate that suffering. We want to be of service to them. And the reason is because two things happen. Actually, many more than that, but in this context, one is we have the release of different hormones or neurotransmitters that stimulate our pleasure and reward centers. So when we care, we feel good. But just as importantly, when we care and we feel good, what that has done is it has shifted us from engagement of our sympathetic nervous system, or this flight, fight, or freeze modality, into the increased tone, if you will, or of the vagus nerve, which stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest mode. And what happens when you stimulate that system is that you're more productive, you're more creative, you're more thoughtful. Because, in fact, in some ways, you shifted from fear to love.
Hmm.
And when you love, when you're not in fear, when you look at the other as yourself or being of service, then it has a huge, profound effect on your physiology. Your blood pressure is lowered. You have an increase in heart rate variability, which is a good thing. Your cardiac function's improved. Your immune system's boosted. Your secretion of stress hormones is diminished. The production of inflammatory proteins is decreased, and they're, of course, associated with chronic disease states. So we are programmed physiologically, both in the brain and our peripheral physiology, to be rewarded and work our best when we care, when we're compassionate. And in fact, that's also associated with an increase in longevity. The interesting thing is that you have immense power over your physiology. Most people don't know it or have not learned to utilize this. And you can look at people who have spent the time learning, as an example, Buddhist monks who spent years in different types of mind training or meditation, and they can adjust their body temperature, their heart rate. And you look at somebody sort of in the West who's done that is Wim Hof, of course, but there are others. And it shows you and answers the question in many ways about what I was saying earlier. Only you can make yourself happy, and only you can change your situation. And I don't mean to imply that nothing happens outside of yourself, but so many people give away their self agency because they're waiting for some magic or external event from the universe to make their life better.
Let's ask the follow up then, which is why are we not taught this? And what should we be doing that we are not?
Well, I think several things happen. One is we are taught this, we just don't listen for most of us. Uh, uh, and I think the other aspect is, though, that we live in a world which is far different from the world in which we evolved to live in. And what I mean by that is evolution, of course, takes millions of years. Yet, if you look at us evolving from a primitive state to modern society, it's a minuscule amount of time comparatively. And our evolution has not caught up with that. And what I mean by that is that on some level, from a genetic or physiologic point of view, we are just like we were on the savannah in Africa 200,000 years ago. And what I mean by that in that situation was you didn't have to go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. You didn't have to drive your kids to daycare. You didn't have to worry about making money to pay the rent or pay for food. Now, that's not to say it was a life of, the life of Riley, because it was dangerous. But that being said, there were resources around and you could lounge around most of the day and still live reasonably well or have plenty of food or shelter. You did have your sympathetic nervous system work very well because it was designed to respond to threat. And certainly in that environment, there was potential threats. But the thing about it was all the negative effects, and many of the ones which, of course, allowed you to escape, uh, would happen, and then they would go right back down again because these events were transitory. You either survived or you didn't, and that played itself out in a matter of minutes.
Right.
What I mean by that is then most of the time your parasympathetic nervous system was engaged. Your physiology was working at its best. You were caring for others. And again, in the modern world, you have so many other stressors on you, which I was just talking about, that keeps many, many people in a constant state of stress and anxiety. And then that leads, of course, us to being hypercritical to ourselves. So we have a constant negative dialogue, which further stimulates the sympathetic nervous system and the negative aspects of that, and it causes people, to suffer. And so when you're internally focused, in some ways, to beat yourself up and not be self-affirming, then that has many negative consequences.
The idea that we joked a second ago, or you joked that we are taught this, but we don't listen. What ways do these lessons show up for us that we ignore?
Well, I think that the challenge is that from an early age, most of our parents teach us these things. They're caring for us. We model ourselves after their behavior. But then soon after, you start being involved in the nature of society and you start meeting people who aren't so nice or people who take advantage or people who are greedy. And then you start looking at the world through having to defend yourself or having to act a certain way to get what you want, or a belief that you have to act a certain way. and you also get, frankly, brainwashed by what has been sold in a Western capitalist society. And that is the narrative that one, you need more to be happy, you have to buy, and that external things are somehow related to happiness, and that success, meaning power, position, uh, and wealth, are somehow related to happiness. And so then so many people go on this journey, and it's a tedious journey that makes many people unhappy. And the sad part is that because there's so much focus in modern society on rich people or people of influence and wealth, that we again get confused because we sit there and say, wow, look at their life. It's so great. I want that to be my life. Now, as you know, if you examine this closely, many of those people are extraordinarily unhappy or miserable people. And what they're doing is foisting on you a narrative that's just not truth. And this is the nature, as you see, of influencers. This is the nature of sort of influencer culture. You have somebody who is trying to present a picture that they're perfect, uh, uh, and their makeup's all perfect, and they look like they're in some resort or on a private aircraft, and they're texting and with a big smile on their face. And of course, essentially all of them are all false narratives. But then you have, unfortunately, people who can be influenced or believe that narrative, and they look at these people and they say, their lives must be amazing. They must be great. And in fact, they're not great at all. And this is why you see a subset of influencers who are so chronically depressed because they're not authentic. They are living a lie that they're presenting to other people. This leads to depression. And for many people, they've committed suicide. Then you look at the influencer side of it, people who believe this, and they sit there saying, I'm imperfect. My life will never be that way. I'm not worthy. I'm disgusting. I shouldn't even be on this earth. Then that leads to another level of depression, and people suffer from that. So it's a very unfortunate, toxic situation that our modern society has created for us. And as you see, once you get on the treadmill of not having enough or keeping up with the Joneses, if you will, then this just leads to this constant cycle of unhappiness. And what's fascinating is if you look at Eastern cultures or traditional cultures where people were in community, people knew you from the day you were born till the day you died, you lived in the same village. uh, the community supported you. They knew all the bad stuff about you, all the good stuff. They tried to guide you in the right direction. You lived with your siblings, your parents, your grandparents, and these people were there to care for you. And this is why, as an example, you look at the literature from the Blue Zones, which is essentially what I described, or from the Harvard study that has been going on for 85 years, the Adult Development Study, I think it's called, that Robert Waldinger is running. Every bit of data tells you that in these types of environments, people respond physiologically. And while, yes, diet's important, exercise is important, by far and away, it's having these types of supportive relationships when you can be authentic, you can be yourself, and even with you feeling maybe even bad about some of the things, you have a supportive environment and you don't have that level of negative self talk that we have so commonly in modern society, which limits our beliefs and the possibilities for ourselves.
Well, let's flip the script on that and let's lean into your newest book, which is called Mind Magic: The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. Let's say that, not dissimilar to you, we came from a childhood that was difficult, and we've navigated, essentially all of us who, if you are listening to this show, you have navigated in some capacity all of the difficulties that you just shared about modern society. And yet there is a way through, over, and around that. And that is what you have studied, and that is what you've written about. So start us off at the start. First of all, maybe let's talk about what's possible, and then give us some steps on how to get to the possible world that we can envision.
Sure. So let's go back a little bit. Uh, I mentioned the term limited beliefs,
Hmm?
and this is what self talk does to you, negative self talk. When you say it's not possible or I can't, then by definition, that becomes truth. And in fact, we know that the brain doesn't distinguish between truth or untruth. If you put it in there, that becomes reality. And in fact, it's interesting as an example, studies have been shown that if people focus mentally on exercising, those muscle groups actually increase in size with them doing nothing other than the mental power. And it's also, in some ways, what I referred to earlier about Wim Hof or these Buddhist monks who train themselves to have access to what is traditionally a subconscious event of which you think you have no control. And so, really, what we're talking about in the context of manifestation, how do we use the knowledge of neuroscience or knowledge we have gained through experience and use that to maximize our ability to manifest our intention? But there are some caveats with that. One is, as an example, what The Secret has taught us. And The Secret is a book that sold millions of copies based on a narrative of the law of attraction, which says that actually there's some external law that if you wish for something hard enough, it will magically happen. And this is based on some information that came out in like 1 to 2 AD with the Hermetics. We don't have to go there, but the point is that has been used in the woo woo or pseudoscience way to somehow legitimize the cultural phenomenon of manifestation. But in fact, many of the aspects of that uh, hold true, but they're negated by what you're taught about it in terms of manifesting. And what do I mean by that? We talked about how in Western capitalist society, there's a belief that success equates with happiness. So many of the woo woo pseudoscience aspects of manifestation relate to that with this narrative. Well, you need to want a car or a mansion or $1 million. And if you get that, your life will be better. You've manifested a happy life. And nothing could be further from the truth. This is a false narrative. Now, that's not to say, as an example, I did it myself when I was 12. I made a list of 10 things that I thought were the most critically important to make me happy. And as ridiculous as it sounds, I think the first one was a Rolex watch. The second one was a Porsche. The third one was a mansion. The fourth one was $1 million. The fifth one was to become a doctor, and on and on. And I did manifest those. And what did I get out of it? What I got out of it was self absorption, narcissism, with a belief that if I did those things, I would get external affirmation that would make me whole, and suddenly I would be happy. And nothing was further from the truth. Here I was at the, if you want to call it the peak of success, where I did go to medical school. I became a neurosurgeon. I became a professor at Stanford. I was a successful entrepreneur. I had run a company that was worth $1.3 billion when it went public. I had everything. I had a mansion overlooking the ocean in Newport Beach. I had a penthouse on the top of a building in San Francisco with my own private elevator and my own private garage. I had Porsches, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Mercedes, Range Rovers, BMWs, blah, 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 blah. I was flying around in private jets, going to private clubs, dating starlets, blah, blah, blah. And all my friends were telling how cool my life was. And it was like I'm on this treadmill doing these things for my friends to tell me how cool I was, yet I was more miserable than I had ever been in my entire life. And I realized through an interesting set of events that um, I had been focused on myself. It was all about I. If I do this, I get that, blah, blah, blah. And I did get those things, but nothing made me feel okay. And it was only after I went through a situation where I lost $80 million dollars in the dot com crash and had to sell everything. And still I was in debt, that I sat back and reflected what the hell happened to me? What were the mistakes that I made? And it really came home when I was dealing with paying back this money I owed to the bank, and I was dealing with my lawyers, obviously. And I had made some commitments to charity by giving away stock in a company that I had run that hadn't gone public. And in dealing with the lawyer, he said, Jim, I have good news for you. The charity you set up, we actually never filed the paperwork. So you actually still have control of all of that stock. And so you don't have to give it away. But after I realized that I was chasing this chimera of quote unquote success, and it was all related to me, money, position, power, I went ahead and told the lawyer to honor those commitments and give all of that money away, which turned out to be $30 million. But it changed my focus. It changed my focus from, and don't get me wrong, I was a good doctor and cared for people, but I was doing it because of me and wanting status and acceptance and to hide my shame and insecurity. When I shift the focus, and this is really the key point, not only in the regard to, if you want to call it true success in my life, but the fundamental basis for manifestation, which is when I change my perspective of saying, how can I be of service to others? How can I care for others? It went from me understanding the difference between what I thought I wanted and what I needed. And this, in some ways, relates to hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness, of course, has to do with maximal pleasure, minimal pain, and it's very transitory. And this relates to being in a fancy car or mansion or people telling you how great you are. It is not long lasting, nor is it deep. When I shifted my focus to be of service to others, it was just the opposite. Because, and I used this quote earlier, if you want to be happy, be compassionate to others. If you want if you want others to be happy, be compassionate. If you want to be happy, be compassionate. And what I mean by that is it's wonderful to be of service to others and see how you can benefit them. But when you care for others, it has a very positive effect on you. Your reward and pleasure centers are stimulated, and your physiology works at its best, which then equates to a deep sense of meaning and purpose, and it actually increases your longevity.
This, um, it seems like we can say this to people. We can, as you're saying it to me here, and there are lots of people listening to you say these words. And yet there seems to be this undercurrent of, yeah, well, I'll take the mansion and the Porsche and then I'll figure it out after. So just give me the drug now, and then I will go through the same spiritual journey that Dr. Jim did. But let me try on the Porsche and the mansion.
I can't argue with that. The problem is that, yes, having the Porsche and the mansion is great, but they don't come without a price. And the price is broken relationships, still being insecure and not fulfilled, chasing after something that's not going to give you what you want. Now, if you want that journey, go for it. But it is not free. And but again, the reality is when you're younger, you say, oh, well, that's not really true. I want to try it for myself. Yes, and many of us do. And that is the way life is. But I think that there's a subset of people who would like to understand how to minimize the self created trauma.
Yes.
And just to mention trauma, just to mention trauma, what is also an issue for so many people is we don't appreciate that the journey we've had in life, if it's traumatic, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with poverty at all, you can be extraordinarily affluent and still suffer deeply. But childhood trauma results in you collecting baggage. And the baggage you collect and carry with you oftentimes is not at a conscious level. And as a result, every decision you make, whether it's about a job or where you're going to live or the relationships you're going to have, many times are based on the baggage which is distorting your worldview. And this is why you see people who, they've been married 3 times to an alcoholic, right? Or an abusive person because they don't understand what is the driver of my behavior. So, one of the things I think is important is to sit down and write down those events in your childhood and sit with them. And also, your present life, what has worked, what has not worked, what are the same mistakes you keep making, and then go back and look at that journey you've been on. And many people will find or gain incredible insights. And again, you it's hard to change if you don't have knowledge about what is causing the underlying problem.
This is why awareness practice in general, I feel like is one of the most profound ways that we can train ourselves, because if you are not aware, right, it follows that it's very difficult to change your current trajectory. To that end, um, you open the book. Actually, I'd like to read. Uh, this is a book about compassion in many ways. It's a book about well, manifesting, but as you said, compassion is a core to this. And the book starts out with, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. It may not sound like it, but this is good news. The universe doesn't give a fuck about you, not because you are not worthy or out of alignment with the cosmos or have been put under a curse for 10 generations. No, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you because it has no fucks to give. So that is a startling and a brilliant opening to a book about compassion. Uh, and yet you launch into that we actually are manifesting, but we are largely not aware of it. So chronicle for us just briefly, if you would, what most people are doing, in hopes that people listening or watching right now could say, oh God, that is me. And with the goal of helping people wake up, becoming aware that they are actually doing this, so that they can take the first step, arguably beyond that, into changing their life. So you are manifesting right now. Let's help people understand and become aware of that. What would you tell someone who is just now realizing that they are doing this and they need to be aware of it? What are they looking for? How do you help them acknowledge and become aware of this?
Well, one thing we just mentioned, of course. Now, of course, I would much rather you read the book or buy the book and read it and not me tell you.
Of course, of course. We're good at purchasing books. It's a good one, folks. By the way, I mean, if that's not an intro, a hook for an intro, I don't know what is.
But yeah, all of us are manifesting, but in some ways, this is very much like if we're looking at improving our physical health. You don't run a marathon the first day you decide to get into shape, right? What typically has to happen? One is you have to be aware, if you will, that you want to get into shape and run a marathon. Most of us are not even at the starting line of the marathon, right? So if you have no knowledge of it and no tools that or don't have a guide, then it's hard to do this, at least in a way where you make it maximally possible for you to manifest. And so the first thing is it's not a one and done. It's not like you wake up and go, I want this, and okay, universe, make it happen with this thought that there's some magical power, or we mentioned earlier, the law of attraction. Uh, and then there's this thing outside of yourself that will now get turned on, and you'll get everything you've ever dreamed of. One of the first lessons is to understand the difference between what you want and what you need. And what I mean by that is many people are seduced by the Western capitalist narrative of if I get wealth, if I get power, if I get position, now I will be happy. So they get lost on that. And we know from innumerable studies, and also actually looking at how people live in Eastern cultures, how that's a false narrative. People strive so hard, they get so focused on accomplishing those things. And then they get there and there's nothing there for them. And part of the problem is, and getting back to awareness, for many people, the drivers of this competitive, ruthless behavior oftentimes is the insecurity or shame that they carry from their childhood trauma. And they're trying to do certain actions that they believe uh, will result in people giving them affirmation that they're okay. And of course, this is not the way to do it because no matter what you have, if you carry that shame and insecurity, no matter what anyone tells you, you are still insecure and filled with shame. And so, what's the point of that story? The point of the story is one, there is no outside power. You are the only person who can give you the gift of happiness and acceptance and affirmation. There's a Stoic philosopher, one of them, by the name of Epictetus, who was a slave. And he made some very wise and profound statements. And one of them is I cannot change my external circumstances, but what I can change is how I react to those circumstances. And so this gets to the point of you giving yourself the gift of happiness, you being okay with yourself, you not try to hide your shame, but accepting it as part of you and not resisting it. It's the resistance that causes people a lot of problems. The other aspect of it is that even accepting the shame, the things you hate about yourself, the mistakes you've made, the reality that you are often a flailing failure in many ways, you still deserve to be loved. You still deserve to be cared for. You are worthy of love. And when you're able to sit and accept that, that changes everything. And it changes the nature of manifestation because when you're working from the mentality of shame and insecurity, that stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fear driver. And it limits the engagement of certain aspects or cognitive brain networks in terms of them working at their best, and which also is part of the book. Not only does it tell that story, but it gives you many examples of how the brain works or doesn't work. And so if you're looking at the world through that lens of fear, then that negatively affects your ability to manifest in the maximal way. Verse if you shift, and what I mean by that is you're no longer focused on self in the sense of, I want this affirmation. You look through the lens of saying, everyone is suffering like me, and they deserve for me to be of service to, if I can, limit their suffering. What happens when you look through that lens is you have a very positive effect on your physiology. You helping another, being of service to another, not only benefits them, it has a huge positive effect on you. And these cognitive brain networks, which are necessary to function well, to have you truly manifest, it is when you shift to this uh, parasympathetic nervous system, or this more open aspect, or looking at the world through the lens of kindness and love, that you have all these positive effects, and you are able to maximize the ability of your brain networks to work together to have you manifest. And when I say you have to understand the difference between what you think you want and what you need, because once you shift from uh, from one attitude to another, everything else shifts, and you have this very, very positive effect. And we can go into the specifically the brain networks, which I'm happy to do. Or if you have another question before then, we can talk about that.
This thread to me is amazing. And what I think you should continue is because people want to hear this information from a neuroscientist. They have the experience of this. They've tasted it, and yet the cultural narrative doesn't support it as well as a Stanford medical doctor, trained neuroscientist. So please keep going. What are the networks that we are sort of activating, and how ought we think of becoming better at that?
Yeah, let me just give a little more background first, and
Great.
then we'll go there. So, one aspect of happiness, if you will, or feeling good, relates to understanding the difference between uh, hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. So, hedonic happiness relates to um, trying to maximize one's pleasure and limit one's pain. Um, and it typically is very fleeting and transitory and shallow. And I'm sure many of your listeners, and whether it doesn't necessarily have to be getting a Porsche, it could simply be getting a new car, or maybe buying something that you'd wanted, and you go, God, if I just get that, that is so great. And then you get it. Let's say it's a scarf or a hat or some sort of a shirt, and you go, God, this is great. And then the next day, it's not so great, and it doesn't have the same effect on you. And because that type of pleasure is very, very transitory, it is not deep at all, it goes away. Versus uh, eudaimonic happiness, which relates to more of not the transient sense of happiness, but the more deeper meaning and purpose associated with true happiness. And this is not transitory, and it's not shallow. And that is related to caring for others. And when you do that, you're not stimulating your sympathetic nervous system. It's not about you. It's not about your fear that's driving you there. It's about caring for others. And when that happens, your brain networks function better. As an example, we talk about this, or I talk about this in the book. And in fact, there's a 6-week program in the book.
On page 208, for anyone who's got the book and is out in front of them. That was
Okay,
where we're going. Yep.
208. But one of the things is you have to understand what you're sort of chasing or trying to manifest, what is potentially blocking that, and then actually let go. Because oftentimes people say, well, I did this and it didn't happen the next day. Or I did this and I sort of got a version of what I wanted, but it wasn't what I thought I wanted, or it wasn't what I said I wanted. And the problem is, of course, one is there are other things that impact, and while you may have maximized your ability to do it, there are external things that may be in conflict. So it's not like you get everything is exactly as you imagine. And the other part is, as an example, I've been planning a World Compassion Festival, which is an incredible idea, bringing spiritual religious leaders, celebrities, musicians, and promoting this version of oneness in the world. Well, I've been working on that for 13 fucking years, right? Well, it hasn't happened yet. Now, does that does that change my belief? in that it's going to happen? No, it's just it doesn't always work on my timeline. The other thing I would like to emphasize, and I meant to do a little bit earlier, is I was talking about how so many people are afraid of being judged or insecure. They carry this shame. And one of the aspects is that there's a Japanese aesthetic, which you're probably familiar with, or there are actually two. One is something called wabi sabi, which is this idea of our incompleteness, imperfection, and impermanence. And many ways, this relates, of course, to Buddhist philosophy. And but the other more important aspect of that is something called kintsugi, which is this idea of also a Japanese aesthetic relating to the reality that in the 15th century, pottery was very expensive and rare, and pieces would get broken. And in the royal households, how that was repaired was usually with a metal staple, and which, of course, was ugly in many ways. And somebody started utilizing glue, but they mixed gold with the glue. And and then it was obvious that the piece had been broken and repaired. And the idea is one should not be ashamed or afraid of showing those parts of themselves because everyone in life gets broken and we put ourselves back together. And the nature of who we are is that broken pottery that we put together and the aspects that it shows those cracks. And that should be something that people should not be fearful of or ashamed of. And this gets back to the nature of authenticity. So many people are afraid of being judged by other people. And this is the nature of limiting your beliefs. And this is the fundamental barrier to manifestation. I'm sure you've been in a position where you had some great idea and you were so excited about it and you told either family, friends, whatever, and people go, you'll never make that happen. Oh, that's a stupid idea. And the sad thing is, people listen to these people. And then as soon as they tell themselves, oh, I can't do it, then that becomes reality. So, one is understanding that what you think you want today isn't necessarily what you need. And then understanding that you are the limiter of your beliefs. And it's fascinating because you can look at how, in reality, utilizing different techniques, you can have a profound effect on your ability to manifest or even control your bodily functions. And again, we mentioned Wim Hof or some of these Buddhist monks. The power is within you. But what happens is that when you have these limiting beliefs, you say, it's not possible, I can't. It's as if you're building a prison out of bricks and the walls get higher and higher and it gets darker. And when you realize suddenly that you have the power, then suddenly you see the light because the sun is now shining and you see that anything is possible. And so that's part of it. The other aspect is many people sit there and say, as an example, I think I mentioned this earlier, well, I'm going to get into shape. I'm going to run a marathon. Well, you don't run the 26 miles on day one. A lot of this has to do with tiny habits where you start out saying, I'm going to get out of bed today and I'm going to walk just down the block. And each day you build on that. But that's the same technique in some ways, changing your limiting beliefs and seeing how anything is possible, but you have to be patient. Now, getting back to brain networks. So there are basically four at play here. One, which many of us are familiar with, is called our executive control network. And this is in the frontal area. And this is where we have access to memory and experience, but it's also where, if you want to call it top down, decisions are made or you do things. Okay. And it's interesting because when you're in the fear mode or anxious or frightened, that shuts that down. Therefore, it limits your ability to manifest. if you shift into a compassionate mode or looking through the lens of how can I be helpful, that is when it functions at its best. Therefore, that's when it gets shit done. Okay. But the other aspects that come in here are a few others. One is the default mode network, and many people call this the uh, um, what do they call it? This is where you have it's mind wandering when you're not actively thinking, but it's also self-referential, and also oftentimes is where you build the narrative of one yourself or what you want. And that then connects to something called the salience network, what is salient to you, and the attention network. So, what happens is that you have to embed your intention, which is the nature of manifestation. And the way you have to do that, one, is to get your mind or your subconscious's attention. Now, what people don't realize is that we have like 10 million bits of information coming into our brains every second from our sensory organs, but we're only able to process on a conscious level 50 to 100. Well, so, and now, of course, most of that information goes to control bodily functions. But the point is that there is an amount that you consciously control, and you can actually embed that into your salience network, which then value tags it so you pay attention to it. Okay. Now, how do you maximize doing that? Well, we know that what fires together wires together. And what I mean by that is uh, it requires intention and repetition. And this is some of what is described, even with the woo woo pseudoscience that's wrapped around manifestation. But, and this has been learned experientially, is that by get you, one way to get the mind's attention is through repetition. Well, how do you do that? We talked about how the sensory organs bring all this information in. Well, one is you write it down, and that means you're consciously thinking about it. Two is you read it silently. Three, you read it aloud. Four, you imagine yourself in that situation. And each of those steps actually causes your brain to rewire, and fundamentally, this idea of neuroplasticity. And what people don't understand is you have control of that, but it requires the effort of doing these things over and over. In fact, when I was with this woman in the magic shop, Ruth, I made this list and I must have written it a million times, which was very irritating, because I'd carry this pad of paper around and I'd be writing this over and over. And it did get embedded and it did happen. But I did not understand the difference between seeking hedonic happiness, which I thought was related to happiness, versus eudaimonic happiness, which is the happiness associated with being of service, caring for others.
I want to call attention to page 208, our joke earlier about that's where the 6-week guide starts. It's very, very effective and it's very clear. This is one of the things that I like specifically about your work is it takes, as you say, the words woo. We've experienced a lot of this where you envision something and it happens, and shifting this to intentionally into strengthening these habits, as you articulated. I'm going to ask a cultural question again. You've said that, okay, we actually do get many of these lessons. We get them from our caring parents. Some people don't have parents that care. We can talk about the childhood trauma. But what's definitely not happening is we are not being trained in this way to use our mind. Why is what you're, as a Stanford MD, why is it mainstream in such a narrow niche? Why isn't this something that we are learning in school? Why is this frankly speaking, it feels like this is revolutionary coming from someone with your level of credential. We've been talking about it for a long time, but why isn't the ability, we train our bodies. That's very obvious. We have to do push-ups and sit-ups, and we have to, what is it? Crawl, walk, run. We can't just run a marathon. But why do we not have that same level of attention to our intention? Why is manifesting not something that we are trained in?
Well, part of it is oftentimes when things get combined with woo woo and pseudoscience, on some level that may attract a subset of people, but it also limits sort of the average person believing it, I think is part of the problem.
Okay.
The other thing is, unfortunately, change is slow. And I'll give you an example. You may or may not know this, but this concept of exercise, right? Exercising to benefit your health. In the 20s, this was completely poo pooed. Nobody really cared about this. And the same with nutrition. And in fact, the first physiology lab to promote exercise, do you know where it ended up being based? It ended up being in the business school at Harvard because it was completely poo pooed by the medical school. Okay. And so, as an example, if you look at mindfulness, nobody had a particular interest in Buddhist philosophy until John Kabat-Zinn brought in this idea of mindfulness to help people deal with pain. And as he will tell you, this was his stealth way of bringing Dharma to the West. uh, uh, and so it was used to deal with pain. And then over decades, scientific work started being done that showed you the value proposition. As an example, in many of the things we're talking about relating to a idea of being of service, of caring, of engaging your parasympathetic nervous system is the fundamental principles behind the good parts of mindfulness. And I can explain that in a minute. Because when you go into a meditative state, you are wishing for the wellness of others, and it has a huge positive effect on how your physiology works. And we can look at the brain structures that are activated. But at the end of the day, it activates your pleasure and reward centers. It has the same positive effect I mentioned as associated with engaging your parasympathetic nervous system. Now, one of the aspects which I have been a little bit critical of, although John disagrees with me, is he says, well, self compassion and compassion for others is implicit, but oftentimes it's misused in the sense that you have, as an example, Wall Street traders who said, well, I've trained myself in meditation. Now I'm a focused, ruthless person who's not distracted, right? It has nothing to
Right.
do with compassion. And in fact, I mean, I've heard some Wall Street people going, yeah, I make my traders take meditation practice so they're more focused. You never hear the word compassion or caring for others. It's how do I become a more ruthless prick? So I shouldn't say that. I'm sure I'm going to get some email.
No, I love it. It's magic to me.
But anyway, so what we've done at the center I run at Stanford, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is a center within the School of Medicine, is we've actually extended that to add a couple other parts. There's the body survey, a focusing. In traditional mindfulness practice, you let these negative commentaries just sort of float by, and your mind doesn't get distracted to address them. What we do is we add the part of self affirmation so that you tone down, decrease the amount of hypercriticality you have, not just ignoring it. And then we explicitly have a compassion practice as well. And I think that is really the true aspect of it. And in fact, Buddhist practice in general is typically completely focused on compassion. I think the reason it was not more explicit is that, again, as John was trying to bring the Dharma in a stealth way to the West, and if it had compassion in it, that wouldn't necessarily appeal to as many Western capitalists. So, anyway, Uh,
That's
Go ahead.
helpful. That's why it's. I mean, it's because of our social structure that it's not trained into us. And your point, I'm gathering, is these things take time. Exercise, it took a long time for that to be a part of our modern vernacular, and it's happening. And this is in part perhaps why you've written this latest book.
Yeah, and again, as you know, I was mentioning my goal to get this World Compassion Festival, 13 years. Well, I mean, if you look at it, it's taken mindfulness, almost 30 years. And interestingly, what you hear nowadays almost every time you talk about mindfulness is now compassion. And I would say that probably some of my work and the work of others in this field have now made people understand that that's a critical part of mindfulness, but it's a critical part of how we lead useful lives that maximize our physiologic and mental health, but also increase our longevity. And that's what caring for others does, or being compassionate. And it's interesting is if you sort of start processing this, being kind, being thoughtful, loving, caring, every one of these is a tenant that all of us should be focused on. That's how we improve society. But this is how you maximize your ability to manifest by embedding these positive intentions for others, and you get rewarded. And it's not necessarily always the reward of I have a new Porsche, although people have said to me, they go, "Oh, so you're saying we should just all do nothing, not try to live quote unquote successful lives or have things?" No, I'm not saying that at all. Listen, I will tell you, I drive a Porsche. I live in a very nice house. But I've also worked very hard, and I'm committed to make improvement in people's lives. But I enjoy driving my Porsche with the top down.
Who
There's nothing
doesn't?
Yes, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's my only focus, that is the problem. As an example, if I were to lose everything, where the Porsche's gone, the house is gone, everything is gone, it will not change my mindset about the world whatsoever. I will be just as happy. I will have the same, and I talk about this in the book, this idea of optimal disposition or an optimistic disposition, because I believe in the ultimate goodness of uh, each of us, its potential, and how it will result in a better world for everybody. And you don't have to be religious to believe that. I, frankly, am an atheist who believes in nothing. The only thing I believe in is this present moment because that's the only thing I have. All the other stuff is like looking out in the universe and saying, oh, there's something there for me. I don't need that. All I need is a belief, a deep belief in the goodness of each and every one of us. And if all of us can look through that lens about our purpose being here is actually to make people's lives better, that is what will make your life better. That is what will allow you to maximally manifest and you get everything you want. But the other aspect is you learn also not necessarily to have attachment because what causes suffering? Attachment and craving.
Mm, that's probably the best way to end this show that I can think of. The advice, the combination of your background in medicine and Western practices and your knowledge of the East is so beautifully brought together in your book. Congratulations again, folks. The book is Mind Magic. Uh, Again, I think I'm going to go on the limb and say this is the best combination that we've seen culturally of bringing these worlds together. Thank you so much for writing it. And would you steer us towards anything else? Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct the attention of the listeners and watchers of the show today to, you have somewhere else you'd like us to go in addition to checking out the book?
Sure. One is the center I run at Stanford, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And you can find that at ccare, ccare.stanford.edu. You can also look at my website, jamesrdoty.md.com. You will find my podcast there, Into the Magic Shop. and we have some interesting guests similar to you, but some unique ones. And then the other thing, just to mention on another note, is I've also been working, and I'd love for your guests to give it a try and give me your thoughts on a mental health app
Mm.
that helps people with stress and anxiety associated with living in this modern world.
How do we get there? Where do we find that?
I'll tell you in one sec, but let me describe it to you because it's quite a bit different than anything anyone has seen before. What it does is it combines what we call an emotion assessment engine that analyzes facial expressions, voice, as well as context of speech to track your emotional state during the conversation.
Wow.
It's connected to a conversational AI knowledge base that has compassion focused therapy and psychology, which it sits on top of, but is not part of an LLM. And the reason I say that is because many of these LLMs, like ChatGPT, hallucinate and make up stuff. So it prevents that. And then it's connected to a human avatar that actually talks to you.
Wow.
And the great thing about it is so many people are afraid of being judged that you can talk to the avatar. And actually, whether you like it or not, similar to, I'm sure you've worn AR
Sure.
glasses,
Yeah.
they put you over an abyss, right? Typically on a plank, and they'll say jump, and most people won't jump, right? Even though on a conscious level, you know you're safe. When you interact with a avatar, human avatar, you make that same emotional connection. You cannot not do that, and that makes that very, very powerful to interact with. And
Brilliant.
some of the answers, in this case, it's a she for now, actually are incredibly profound. And people have a positive relationship because they know they're not being judged. And also, the other fascinating thing about it is that, unlike your therapist, what happens after 5 o'clock? You get, if this is a life threatening emergency, yet for almost everybody, your stress and anxiety don't happen before 5. They happen late at night when you're alone and ruminating. And
So true.
we know that if you can just talk to somebody for 10, 15 minutes, just talking, expressing yourself, being listened to, for most people, that dissipates that feeling of anxiety and stress. So, anyway, the website is called Happy, HAPPI dot AI, HAPPI.ai. And I would encourage you, you can sign up for free, use it. We're just testing it out, trying to improve it. This is,
Mm.
still an MVP, but we're going to try and officially launch it in the next 3 months or so. So, any feedback from anybody, but please try it, and I hope it does offer you benefit.
So grateful for our time today. Thank you, Dr. James. And folks, check out the book. Fantastic. Until next time, from Dr. James Doty and myself, we bid you a great day, and thanks for paying attention.
Thank you.